The airport buzzed with noise, announcements blaring, suitcases rolling, and people rushing to catch their flights. Near the check-in counters, a young boy, no older than 7, stood nervously beside his mother. He clutched a small toy plane in his hands, his eyes wide with excitement. Today was his first time flying, and he couldn't wait to see the big aircraft up close. His mother, dressed in simple but neat clothes, adjusted her scarf and smiled down at him. "You ready?" she asked softly. The boy nodded eagerly, bouncing on his toes. Nearby, an airline employee, a tall man with a sharp uniform and an even sharper expression, watched them with barely hidden disdain. His job was to assist passengers, but not all passengers were equal in his eyes. When it was their turn, the boy stepped forward, holding out his tiny boarding pass with both hands. The employee glanced at it, then at the boy, his lip curling slightly. "You sure this is yours?" he asked, his tone dripping with doubt. The boy blinked, confused, but nodded again. The man scoffed, turning to his mother. "These tickets aren't cheap. You better not be trying anything funny." The mother's smile faded. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut through the tension. "Everything all right here?" A well-dressed man in an expensive suit approached, his calm presence immediately drawing attention. The airline employee stiffened, his expression shifting from arrogance to unease. The little boy, however, lit up. "Dad," he exclaimed, running to hug the man's leg. The employee's face went pale. The man he had just mocked wasn't just any passenger, he was the CEO of the very airline he worked for. Silence fell over the counter as the reality of the situation sank in. The CEO looked down at his son, then at the employee, his gaze unreadable. The mother placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm, but her eyes held a quiet warning. The employee swallowed hard. He had made a terrible mistake, one that could cost him everything. The airport noise seemed to fade into the background as the employee stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The CEO's expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity, that made the man's stomach twist. The little boy, still holding onto his father's leg, looked up at him with innocent confusion. "Dad, why is he mad at us?" the boy whispered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The CEO placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder but didn't take his eyes off the employee. "I don't know," he said evenly. "Maybe he can explain." The employee's throat went dry. He had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. This wasn't just a passenger, this was the man who signed his paychecks. His mind raced for an excuse, but nothing came out. The mother, sensing the tension, stepped in. "It's all right," she said softly, though her voice carried a quiet strength. "Let's just get checked in." But the CEO didn't move. He tilted his head slightly, waiting. Passengers nearby had started to notice the scene. A few had their phones out, recording discreetly. The employee could feel sweat forming on his forehead. He had seen videos like this before, videos that went viral, that got people fired. I was just doing my job," he stammered. "Standard procedure." The CEO raised an eyebrow. "Standard procedure to question a child's ticket?" The employee swallowed hard. I thought there might have been a mistake." The little boy frowned. "But I gave you my ticket. It's mine." His voice was small but firm. The CEO finally looked away from the employee and knelt down to his son's level. "I know it is," he said gently. Then, standing back up, he turned to his wife. "Go ahead and check in. I'll catch up in a minute." She nodded, taking their son's hand and leading him away. The boy glanced back once, his earlier excitement now replaced with confusion. As soon as they were out of earshot, the CEO's calm demeanor shifted. His voice was low but sharp. "What's your name?" The employee hesitated. "John," he lied quickly, glancing at his name tag, which clearly read something else. The CEO's eyes flicked to the tag, then back up. Try again. The man's shoulders slumped. He knew there was no way out. The employee's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. He couldn't bring himself to meet the CEO's gaze anymore. "Michael," he muttered, finally telling the truth. "Michael Reynolds." The CEO nodded slowly, as if filing the name away in his mind. Around them, the usual airport chaos continued, boarding calls, laughing travelers, rolling luggage, but right there at the check-in counter, time seemed to stand still. "You've worked here for how long, Michael?" the CEO asked, his tone deceptively calm. 3 years, Michael replied, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years, the CEO repeated. "And in all that time, did anyone ever teach you that the way you treated my family was standard procedure?" Michael's mouth opened, then closed. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He had been rude, no, worse than rude. He had assumed things about them, judged them without reason. And now, standing in front of the one person who could end his career with a single word, he realized just how badly he'd messed up. A few feet away, a woman in a staff uniform hesitated before stepping forward. She was older, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense posture, a senior supervisor who had seen everything in her decades at the airport. "Sir," she said carefully, "is there a problem?" The CEO turned to her. "What's your name?" "Linda Carter, head of customer service for this terminal." He studied her for a moment, then gestured toward Michael. "Does your team often treat passengers like this?" Linda's expression tightened. She had heard the commotion but hadn't caught the full exchange. Still, she knew Michael, knew his attitude sometimes slipped when he thought no one important was watching. "Absolutely not, sir," she said firmly. "If there was any disrespect, that's not how we operate." The CEO crossed his arms. "Then I suggest you and I have a longer conversation. But first," he turned back to Michael. "I think an apology is in order." Michael's face burned. Apologize? In front of everyone? Passengers had stopped to watch now, some whispering behind their hands. His pride screamed at him to resist, but fear won out. I'm sorry," he forced out. "It won't happen again." The CEO didn't smile. "No, it won't." Then, to Linda, "I'll be in touch." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing there, his future hanging by a thread. Near the security line, the little boy tugged his mother's sleeve. "Is Dad coming?" he asked. She smiled and smoothed his hair. "Yes, baby. He's just taking care of something first." The boy nodded, but his earlier excitement had dimmed. "That man was mean," he said quietly. His mother sighed, pulling him closer. "Some people forget how to be kind. But that doesn't mean we do." Just then, the CEO rejoined them, his stern expression softening as he looked at his son. "Ready to see the plane up close?" he asked, forcing cheer into his voice. The boy perked up a little. "Yeah." As they walked away, Michael watched from the counter, his stomach churning. Linda gave him a long, disappointed look before turning to the next passenger with a practiced smile. Michael knew one thing for certain, his day was far from over. The moment the CEO walked away, Michael felt the weight of every eye in the terminal on him. Passengers whispered behind cupped hands, their glances sharp with judgment. Linda, the supervisor, waited until the CEO was out of earshot before turning to Michael with a quiet fury that scared him more than shouting ever could. "My office. Now." The walk through the bustling airport felt like a march to the gallows. Michael kept his head down, but he could still feel the stares burning into him. A young couple shook their heads as he passed. A grandmother pulled her granddaughter closer. His uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a neon sign announcing his shame. Linda's office was small and cluttered with paperwork. She shut the door firmly behind them before speaking. "What in God's name were you thinking?" Michael opened his mouth, but Linda held up a hand. "No. Don't even try to explain. I've had complaints about your attitude before, but this? Humiliating a child? And not just any child." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Michael's knees felt weak. He sank into the chair across from her desk. "I didn't know who they were," he muttered. Linda let out a bitter laugh. "That's your defense? That you're only rude to people you think can't fight back?" The truth of her words hit him like a slap. He'd always told himself he was just doing his job, enforcing rules, but deep down, he knew. He'd enjoyed the little power trips, the way some passengers shrank under his scrutiny. Until today. Linda pinched the bridge of her nose. "Corporate's already called. The CEO wants you gone by end of shift." Michael's head snapped up. "He can't. He owns the airline, Michael. He can." Linda's expression softened slightly. "Look, I don't like this either. But you brought a flamethrower to a job that requires a smile. What did you expect?" Outside the office window, a plane taxied down the runway. Michael had always loved watching them take off, the power, the freedom. Now all he felt was the crushing weight of consequences. Meanwhile, near gate 14, the little boy pressed his face against the window, his earlier sadness forgotten as a massive 787 Dreamliner rolled by. "Dad! It's even bigger than on TV." The CEO smiled, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the terminal. His phone buzzed, a message from HR confirming Michael's termination. He silenced it. His wife touched his arm. "You did what you had to." He sighed. "I know. But that man's not the real problem." She raised an eyebrow. "He's a symptom," the CEO continued quietly. "How many others act like him when they think no one's watching? How many families has he made feel small before today?" His son, oblivious to the tension, tugged his sleeve. "Dad, can we go inside the plane now? Please?" The CEO pushed his thoughts aside and ruffled the boy's hair. "Absolutely. Let's go meet your first cockpit." As they boarded, a young flight attendant greeted them with genuine warmth. But when she spotted the CEO's face, her professional smile faltered for just a second, long enough for him to notice. He made a mental note to check her personnel file later. The cockpit visit should have been the highlight of the boy's day. The captain smiled warmly as he showed off the controls, even letting the child pretend to steer for a photo. But the CEO stood slightly apart, watching the flight crew's every move with new eyes. That flicker of hesitation from the attendant earlier, had he imagined it? Or was she just another employee who treated passengers differently based on appearances? Back in first class, as his son excitedly chattered about the plane's wings, the CEO pulled out his tablet. With a few taps, he accessed the airline's internal complaint database. The numbers made his stomach turn. Dozens of reports just this month about unprofessional behavior from staff, most involving minority passengers. Each one marked resolved with generic responses about retraining. His wife noticed his clenched jaw. "What is it?" He showed her the screen. "We've been fixing symptoms instead of curing the disease." Meanwhile, in the airport's employee parking lot, Michael shoved his few personal items into a cardboard box. His security badge had already been deactivated. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as he fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before finally unlocking his car. His phone buzzed. A text from a coworker. "Dude, everyone's talking about it. You messed up bad." Michael threw the phone onto the passenger seat so hard it cracked the screen. He wasn't a bad person, was he? He'd never used slurs, never put hands on anyone. So what if he'd been a little stern sometimes? Rules were rules. But then he remembered the boy's face, that moment when childish excitement had crumpled into confusion. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. At 30,000 feet, the CEO stood in the galley with the senior flight attendant, a woman who'd worked for the airline longer than he'd owned it. "Tell me the truth, Janice," he said quietly. "How bad is it really?" She hesitated, then sighed. "You know how luggage handlers joke about fragile stickers, meaning throw extra hard? Some staff, they have that same attitude with certain passengers." The ice in his drink cracked loudly as he set it down. "Why wasn't I told?" Janice gave him a look that held decades of frontline experience. "Reports get lost. Complaints from certain types of travelers get labeled as oversensitive. And honestly, most people just accept it as how flying is." Through the curtain, he could see his son laughing as his wife helped him color a picture. That joy could have been stolen by one man's casual cruelty. How many other children had their first flight memories tainted the same way? Michael's apartment felt suffocating. He paced the length of his tiny living room, ignoring the beer sweating on the coffee table. The news played silently on TV, another story about some corporation's diversity initiative. He'd always rolled his eyes at that stuff. Now, his reflection in the dark window looked unfamiliar. Was this who he'd become? The guy who made kids cry? The villain in some viral video? His phone lit up with a notification. A LinkedIn message from an old friend who worked at a rival airline. "Heard what happened. We could use someone with experience." Michael stared at the words. A fresh start. No one would have to know. He reached for his phone just as the news channel switched to a story about the airline CEO's recent speech on corporate responsibility. The man's face filled the screen, earnest and determined. "Change starts with accountability," the CEO was saying. "Not just for individuals, but for the systems that enable them." Michael's finger hovered over the screen. Outside, a plane roared overhead, its lights blinking in the gathering dark. The CEO sat in his home office late that night, the glow of his laptop casting sharp shadows across his face. Spreadsheets of complaint data, employee records, and training manuals filled the screen. Every document told the same ugly story: his airline had a sickness, and firing one rude employee wasn't going to cure it. His wife appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Still working?" she asked, setting down his favorite coffee. He rubbed his eyes. "We need complete overhaul. New training programs. Secret shoppers. Maybe even cleaning house," she finished gently. The CEO nodded grimly. The thought of mass firings turned his stomach, but how many second chances had they already wasted? Meanwhile, Michael sat on his couch staring at the half-completed job application on his tablet. The reason for leaving previous position, field blinked accusingly. He typed, "seeking new opportunities," then deleted it. His apartment buzzer startled him. Through the peephole he saw Linda, his former supervisor, standing stiffly in the hallway. "What do you want?" he asked through the door. "To talk," she said. 5 minutes. Michael hesitated, then unlocked the door. Linda looked older under the harsh hallway lights, her usual crisp uniform replaced by a simple sweater and slacks. She got straight to the point. "Corporate's auditing our entire terminal. They're reviewing every complaint from the past 3 years." Michael's throat tightened. So, Linda sighed, "they found multiple incidents where you were reported for similar behavior. All buried by previous management." The air left Michael's lungs. He'd convinced himself today was a one-time mistake, but the evidence said otherwise. Linda handed him a business card. "The CEO's starting a new program, Second Chances with Serious Conditions. Counseling. Mentoring. If you're willing to actually change. Michael stared at the card. The company logo he'd worn proudly for years now felt like a brand. Why would he? Because unlike you, Linda said quietly, he understands people can do better. At corporate headquarters the next morning, the airline's board members shifted uncomfortably as the CEO presented his plan. Retraining isn't enough, he said, clicking to a slide showing passenger demographic data. When 78% of our discrimination complaints come from just 25% of flyers, that's not bad apples, that's orchard rot. An older board member cleared his throat. With respect, people are too sensitive these days. A few complaints are why we're losing the youth market, the CEO interrupted. He displayed a social media analytics report. Gen Z travelers are actively warning each other about us. That's millions in future revenue walking away. The room fell silent. Nothing motivated change like threatened profits. Michael stood outside the airline's training center, the business card damp in his sweaty palm. Through the glass doors he could see new posters in the lobby, "Service with respect," and "Every passenger matters," in bold letters. His phone buzzed. The rival airline's HR department, "We'd like to schedule your interview." He looked between the phone and the doors, torn between running from his past or facing it. A young family walked past him into the building, their laughter floating back through the automatic doors. Taking a deep breath, Michael made his choice. The automatic doors hissed shut behind Michael as he stepped into the training center lobby. The air smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, like the company was physically trying to wash away its past. A receptionist looked up, her polite smile freezing slightly when she recognized him. The viral video had clearly made the rounds. "Michael Reynolds," she asked, though they both knew she didn't need to. "They're waiting for you in conference room B." The walk down the hallway felt longer than his 3 years with the airline. Through glass walls, he saw groups of employees in new, inclusive service training sessions. One facilitator was demonstrating how to kneel when speaking to children in wheelchairs. Another group role-played assisting non-English speakers. It was like watching an entire company learn to breathe differently. Conference room B held just 3 people, Linda, a severe-looking woman from HR, and, Michael's stomach dropped, the CEO himself, scrolling through something on his tablet. The CEO looked up. "Sit." No greeting, no small talk. Michael sat. The HR woman slid a thick document across the table. "This outlines the Second Chance program. 6 months probation. Mandatory sensitivity training twice weekly. You'll be mentored by senior staff and work baggage claim," the CEO finished. Michael blinked. "Baggage claim?" "Midnight shift," the CEO continued. "Where our most exhausted, angriest passengers go after delayed flights and lost luggage. You'll learn real quick whether your customer service philosophy holds up." Linda gave Michael a warning glance before he could protest. The HR woman tapped the contract. "You'll also attend counseling, on our dime, to address whatever biases made you think mistreating that child was acceptable." Michael's face burned. The word biases made it sound like he was some cartoon villain. He'd never considered himself racist, just someone who enforced rules. But remembering how quickly he'd judged that family, maybe the truth was uglier. The CEO stood abruptly. "I don't like this program, Reynolds. I believe some mistakes should be career-ending." He braced his hands on the table. "But my son asked why that mean man wasn't getting help to be nicer." Michael's throat tightened. "So this?" The CEO gestured at the contract. "This is me teaching my boy that people can change. Don't make me a liar." With that, he walked out, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats behind. That night, Michael reported for his first baggage claim shift. The chaos was immediate. A storm-delayed flight had just disgorged 200 sleep-deprived travelers. A woman screamed about her missing wedding dress. A man threatened to sue over damaged golf clubs. And then came the family. The mother had that same tired but patient look the CEO's wife had worn. Her son clutched a stuffed dinosaur, eyes drooping with exhaustion. Their suitcase was nowhere to be found. "Please, sir," the mother said wearily, "it has my son's medication." Old Michael would have cited policy, made them fill out forms, dismissed their panic with bureaucratic calm. New Michael looked at the boy's pale face and made a decision. "Give me 15 minutes, he said, and took off at a jog toward the overflow storage room. The CEO watched the security footage the next morning. He rewound the clip of Michael frantically digging through unclaimed luggage, then personally driving the recovered suitcase to the family's hotel at 3 a.m. His wife peered over his shoulder. "Progress?" "Maybe," the CEO murmured. On screen, Michael accepted the mother's tearful thanks with visible discomfort. It was the first time the CEO had seen him look genuinely human. 6 months later, the airport buzzed with its usual chaotic energy. But something was different now. The staff moved with a new awareness, backs straightened when passengers approached, forced smiles had been replaced by genuine ones. The changes weren't perfect, but they were visible. Michael stood at the baggage claim carousel, his uniform crisp, posture alert. The midnight shift had etched dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze was clearer than it had been in years. When an elderly woman struggled with her suitcase, he was there before she could ask. "Allow me, ma'am," he said, hefting the bag with ease. She blinked in surprise at his courtesy. "Oh. Thank you, young man." It was a small moment. The kind that wouldn't make headlines or go viral. But it mattered. Up in the executive offices, the CEO reviewed the latest customer satisfaction reports. The numbers were improving, though more slowly than shareholders wanted. His assistant knocked gently. "Your 2 o'clock is here, sir." The CEO straightened his tie. "Send him in." Michael entered cautiously, clutching a folder. The plush carpet and floor-to-ceiling windows were worlds away from baggage claim's concrete floors. "You wanted to see me, sir?" The CEO gestured to a chair. "How's the program treating you?" Michael sat stiffly. "The night shifts are educational." A ghost of his old smirk appeared, then vanished. "But the counseling helps." "More than I expected." The CEO studied him. The arrogant check-in agent was gone. In his place sat a humbler man, one who'd learned the weight of his actions. "You've had 0 complaints in 4 months, the CEO said, sliding a report across the desk. "Your trainers say you're one of the most engaged participants they've seen." Michael's fingers trembled slightly on the paper. "I didn't realize how much damage I was doing. Not just to passengers, to myself." Silence stretched between them, filled with all the things that couldn't be said, the pain caused, the trust broken, the long road back. Finally, the CEO spoke. "We're reinstating you tomorrow. Not at check-in, you'll train new hires in customer service." Michael's head snapped up. "Sir? If anyone knows how not to treat passengers, it's you." The CEO allowed himself a small smile. "And apparently, you've learned how they should be treated." That evening, the CEO sat on his son's bed, listening to the boy's excited recap of his day. "And then we built the tallest Lego tower ever and it crashed and it was awesome." The CEO laughed, smoothing his son's hair. No shadows lingered from their bad airport experience, children forgave easier than adults. "Dad?" The boy grew serious. "Is that mean man still working at the airport?" The CEO considered his answer carefully. "He's trying to be better. That's all any of us can do." His son nodded sagely, already half asleep. "Good. Everybody deserves second chances." As the boy's breathing evened out, the CEO thought about the hundreds of employees in his airline, each with their own biases and blind spots. Real change would take years. There would be setbacks. But today, at least, they'd taken another step forward. The next morning, Michael stood before a classroom of new hires. Their faces were eager, unmarked by the cynicism that had once twisted his own worldview. Rule number 1, he said, voice steady. Every passenger matters. Not just the wealthy ones, not just the ones who look like you. Everyone. Outside, a plane roared into the sky, carrying its precious cargo of human stories, some just beginning, some seeking redemption, all deserving of dignity. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he was exactly where he belonged.